Hey, welcome back. Today's video is about the 10 lessons that I've learned from high volume practice for PRS that I'm going to share with you in hopes that you can benefit from them as well. Now, why am I shooting high volume in practice for PRS? Well, I want to get better at it. And a lot of rounds of live fire are necessary to get there. That's in addition to dry fire shooting because the two are not directly interchangeable. As a matter of fact, they teach you different things and you need to learn both of them in order to be successful in any competition shooting. So, regardless of whether you're shooting PRS, F-class, or some other shooting discipline, you're going to need to do both dry fire and live fire in order to get better, which means you're going to need a lot of ammunition and other components, which is the first lesson. Get ahead of your supply chain. You're going to need barrels, bullets, brass, powder, primers, and lots of spare parts for your rifle. So make sure that you have a good supply chain established. Order ahead of time so that you have a good supply on hand, because ultimately running out of components is the one thing that will stop you faster than anything else in competition shooting. Now, while I'm thinking about supply chain, you also need to think about gunsmithing services if you aren't chambering your own barrels, for instance. So make sure you have your gunsmith lined up and primed to do barrels for you. In other words, don't wait till you need a barrel to do a barrel. Instead, do a barrel ahead of time. I have a couple of spares sitting here, brand new, still wrapped in the snakeskin, waiting to go on the rifle. Because when I need the next barrel, I need the next barrel right then, not 6, 8, 10 weeks from then. In other words, plan ahead so you don't get behind. Which brings me to the second lesson, and that's load development. Develop a reliable load for your rifle that you can use across the entire year without having to redevelop it all the time. By that same notion, use the same components continuously. I use 105 hybrids right now in 6-dasher. I'm not going to be changing back and forth from bullet to bullet unless I absolutely have to. I'm just going to run 105 hybrids for the entire year if I have any possibility of doing so. Number 3 is important no matter which discipline you're shooting, and that is to inspect your brass every time you handle it. For instance, this piece of 6-dasher alpha brass that was in my brass actually wasn't one of mine. It has far more firings on it than any of the other brass that I have. Obviously, while picking up brass following a stage at a PRS match, we picked up the wrong piece at some point. Whether it was me or someone else doesn't really matter. I have a piece of brass that wasn't originally mine. And as a result, this brass has reached its age limit. It has an incipient head separation right here. And if I hadn't been looking at the brass because the brass otherwise is so new, I wouldn't have noticed it. And then I would have had a bad outcome. So always inspect your brass. Which brings me to lesson number 4, which is to handle the brass the least number of times possible from the time it's fired until you're loading into the magazine again for the next firing. That means not loading loading trays before each and every operation of your reloading process. It means combining processes, either through a progressive press or my poor man's progressive setup that I've shown you before, and doing other things in batches so that you're not having to put your hands on the brass all the time. Speaking of brass processing, once you're done annealing, sizing, trimming, and expanding, and then cleaning, of course, do yourself a favor and prime the brass. Store your ready-to-shoot brass in a primed condition so that you can focus on the priming when you're priming and the loading when you're loading. Because there's nothing worse than loading a whole batch of ammo and finding out you hadn't put primers in it and have to go redo that entire process again. Not that I've ever done that. While we're still thinking about that, I've found that it is more efficient to process the brass as soon as I get home from the range. In other words, don't let it lay around and build up into large lots unless you're going to take a day off from work to process 500 or 1,000 pieces of brass at a time. If you can do that, good on you. Personally, I have a day job and a night job here, so I can't spend a bunch of time in any one sitting to process 500 or 1,000 pieces of brass. I am much better off at this point in my life to go ahead and do that 100 rounds a week so that I'm continuously processing brass instead of doing it in a big lump in a large effort. Now, this one's going to tick some people off. Clean your barrel less often. Seriously, guys, this barrel that I'm shooting right now, well, let me just show you. At 300 rounds since the last cleaning, I decided to shoot this 8-round group. Now, the group's nothing to write home about, but it is less than half a minute of angle, and that one shot was definitely me, but I don't exclude shots, so you get to see the whole thing. By the same token, the ES and SD are both single digit. Still. Now, that doesn't mean never clean your barrel. What I'm saying is don't clean it so frequently. For me, I normally would clean it 200 rounds, but I can go 300 pretty easily and still have a perfectly viable rifle. And I know that from my testing. Can I go 600, 700? Maybe when the barrel's kind of young, doesn't have a lot of firecracking. But as the fire cracking builds up, you're going to want to clean it a little more often because fire cracking has teeth, and those teeth grab onto carbon and copper and just general debris. They also give a good environment for rust and pitting to start. So you're going to want to clean the barrel a little more frequently as it gets older, and that just means cleaning it every 200 to 300 rounds. On the other hand, you don't need to clean it after every 75 or 50 rounds of shooting. Some disciplines do that, but I don't find it necessary for what I'm trying to do in either F-class or PRS. Which brings me to the next lesson. You don't have to be quite so anal about your powder charge. Now, I'm not talking about being sloppy, being plus or minus a tenth. What I'm talking about is, like this V4, it gives you a tolerance of plus or minus 0.02 grains, 2/100ths of a grain. Is that good enough? Absolutely it is. As long as the green light is on when I'm done throwing a charge, I just use that charge. Now, when I was shooting F-class, I was reducing that to +0 minus 2/100ths of a grain, but that's not necessary and never has been. So don't be so anal about your powder charges. Let the machinery do its work and accept what it outputs unless you see on the scale that there is really something wrong, in which case, take a couple granules out and continue with your powder dispensing. And speaking of loading ammo, load your ammunition well ahead of time. Remember that group I just showed you from 300 rounds? That ammunition had been sitting around here rolling around in ammunition boxes for over 3 weeks before I shot that. Being absolutely fresh from annealing and sizing is not completely necessary in order to get good results from your shooting, which means that you aren't going to want to overclean your brass. Stainless steel pin cleaning gets brass super clean, but it does have this downside of getting the inside of the necks a little too clean for my liking, which means that the likelihood of getting galling between the bullet and the case is a little higher, and that could ruin your consistency if you're loading ahead of time. Instead of doing that, I like using dry media because it makes it easier for me to just load whenever I can and then shoot the ammunition whenever I want. Now, that also means that my one load theory is really important. If you're having to juggle loads between various bullets and various powders, you're going to have some problems with this. For me, I'm just loading Varget 105 hybrids, 450 primers in an alpha case and going for it. And it works perfectly well and shoots super small groups and gives me everything I need when I'm out for a competition. And the last lesson is that shooting is supposed to be fun. If you aren't having fun, you're doing it wrong. So if your ears are ringing when you're done or you have a headache when you're done, you are doing something wrong that is causing you problems. Go find the problem and solve it. For me, with a muzzle brake, regardless of who makes it, shooting in these covered firing areas is a real problem because the sound reflects off of the nearby wall. Double hearing protection solves that problem for me and makes my shooting much more enjoyable. By the same token, this Botnia brake is making my shooting a lot more enjoyable because I can just watch the bullet go down range. And that is a really, really fun experience, and I wish it for each and every one of you. Those are the 10 lessons that I've learned from putting so many rounds down range in a short period of time. Do you have other efficiency tips? Put them in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, shoot straight, and I'll see you in the next video.